Sorry, I'm just getting a message. Okay. So what Lippmann here is pointing out is the importance of information and knowledge for democratic functioning. And it's fundamentally an epistemological point that he's making here. And my suspicion is that this sort of epistemological thinking about politics can strike people as very uncomfortable because you really do need to start from the position of questioning everything that we believe, that the individual believes, because the focus is on the kind of arbitrariness of the information that we happen to absorb based on where we were born, who our parents were, our peers, schools, what we learned through the media, et cetera. So that's kind of the starting point for a lot of my research, is focusing on what people know, what information they have, and equally as important, what information they do not have. So why does knowledge matter? Now, for probably most of you listening to this, you're, I would assume, in the sort of democratic theory camp, where the importance of information is kind of obvious, that you need to have a population that is well informed so that they can make sensible judgments as they govern themselves. You could look at this quote from Thomas Jefferson, that if we think the people isn't enlightened enough to exercise their control of government, then the remedy is not to take their ability away from them to control their government, but rather to inform their discretion by education. So this is more of a normative perspective. However, it's not the only normative perspective. Within international relations theory, you had some of the founders of the field, classical IR realists, who believed that the people were too emotional and too irrational to really be trusted with foreign policy decisions. Rather, public opinion is something that should be created and recreated by an informed and responsible leadership. So in this view, it really doesn't matter so much what people believe, so long as what people know and understand and believe about foreign affairs is shaped by an informed and responsible leadership. You also have another school of thought in international relations, the neo-realists, who basically say, you know, it doesn't really matter what people know, what they don't know, whether they're rational or irrational, because the international system as a system has properties that tend towards homeostasis. That is, if the public or their leadership continues to make errors, then they're going to get feedback from the system that is going to tell them, hey, you made an error and you should move in a different direction. So the systemic features will kind of push leaders and publics alike in the most effective direction or towards the best foreign policy decisions. But I just wanted to note here, one of the inspirations for this borrowing, or rather, one of the founders of cybernetic theory, which was an inspiration for the neo-realists, is that if you have elite control of the media, that can be a fundamental way to push a society away from homeostasis, because the correcting mechanisms just don't work correctly when you have elite domination or elite manipulation of the media, hence elite manipulation of what people know and also what people don't know. So this is the kind of different normative perspectives on why knowledge might be important or might not be important. But, you know, modern militaries take the view that information is extremely important. There's the whole concept of information warfare, where the realm of knowledge is seen to be a battlefield where competing countries try to influence public opinion. And that's important because it can affect voting choices, support for different foreign policies, morale overall. So from a military view, it's pretty obvious that information is important. Knowledge about foreign policy controversies is important. And one of the main reasons why information and knowledge is so important is that what it effectively does is delimits the range of opinions that are likely to be formed about something. And so I'll just give you an example I've used in class about how this works. So I'm going to give you two countries, and I'm just going to give you a limited set of information about these two countries. So in country A, its recent history involves waging illegal wars of aggression to serve what it sees as its interests. It has supported dictators in other countries who are willing to support country A's interests as opposed to the interests of their own population and against principles of democracy. And it has used its economic power to maximize its wealth at the expense of poorer countries. Then consider country B, and this is some information about country B. This is a country that welcomes immigrants and refugees from all over the world. It's produced culture and art that is popular almost universally. People appreciate its culture and art all over the place. And another feature of country B is that it supports sexual minorities by passing laws that prohibit discrimination. Now, some of you probably already could figure out, as some people in my class do as well, that I'm actually just talking about the same country, talking about the US here. But if you only had, and by the way, all of this information is true, it's factually accurate. But if the only information you had was in the country A column, your opinion about the US would be quite different than if your information about the US was only that information which appears in the country B column. So this is just a really simple illustration of how important it is, or how information and knowledge about foreign policy issues is incredibly important. There's another more practical, less abstract example I could provide about how important knowledge is in the realm of foreign policy and international affairs. So imagine that you are a US American in 2003, say in January or February of 2003. And let's say that the only thing you know, because your information sources have told you only this information, and that information is the US government claims that Iraq is working on weapons of mass destruction programs, that the Iraqi government has close links with Al-Qaeda. This is, of course, only 2 years after 9/11, so there's a lot of fear about Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. And you know that there is evidence of Saddam Hussein's government committing atrocities against people in Iraq, also in the war with Iran, etc. So you can imagine the kinds of opinions you're likely to develop if this is the only information that you have relevant to the Iraq war. Now imagine if you knew those claims, but you also had additional information, additional knowledge. You knew that UN weapons inspectors have been disputing these US government claims about weapons of mass destruction. You know that Saddam Hussein has a long history of antipathy towards Islamic fundamentalism, seeing that as a threat to his own power and the power of the Ba'ath Party. And then lastly, you also know that the US government actually supported Hussein while he was committing atrocities against his own people, primarily the Kurdish people. So you can just imagine, I think very clearly with this example, that if you only know the information on the left-hand column, you're more likely to develop an opinion supportive of the invasion. Whereas if you know the information in the left column and the right column, you also have, there's a greater likelihood that you might develop an opinion against the war. Now, it doesn't determine your opinion, because you can think that, you know, the UN weapons inspectors might be wrong. You might think that Hussein changed his opinion about Islamic fundamentalism. About that last point, you might think that, you know, the US government sometimes supports unfavorable, unseemly characters. But you know, that can be justified for geopolitical reasons, et cetera. So you can still form an opinion in favor of the war if you know both sets of information. But if you only know one set of information on the left, the likelihood, the probability that you'll develop an opinion against the war is much less likely. So that's really the importance of information and knowledge. It doesn't determine opinions, but it sort of probabilistically delimits the range of opinions one is likely to be able to form. So then the question that we were interested in is, what do people in the US and Russia know about the background, the historical context of the recent war in Ukraine. So we used signal detection theory, a technique from signal detection theory, to try to get at the level of accuracy in knowledge and bias in knowledge that we could find in the samples we got for Russia and the US. And so using this technique, you get a score called D prime, which basically measures your knowledge accuracy. That is, how well did you do at distinguishing true items from false items? And then you also have a criterion score. And this basically just measures your bias in favor of answering true or false. And so this can be used as a kind of measure of motivated reasoning, perhaps. It can also be exposure to, predominantly pro-Russia or pro-US media sources. It just indicates that in the end, no matter how you got there, there seems to be some sort of bias because you tend to be answering true to certain types of questions or false to other types of questions. So I first got interested in the use of this SDT signal detection technique when I read this paper by Nelson, Adams, and Salter from 2013. And what they did was they created an SDT survey. Half of the items were true, half were false, about the history of racism in the United States. And furthermore, the items were split not just between true and false, but between items that they called celebratory versus critical. So a celebratory item would be something like, Jackie Robinson becoming the first Afro-American Major League Baseball player, and thereby helping to advance the cause of civil rights in the U.S. And a critical instance, an instance of critical history that would be a true item for them, could be something like, the history of redlining in the US, where banks essentially said, we're not going to give mortgage loans to Afro-American families in certain neighborhoods. So basically what they found using this technique was that people who had more accurate knowledge of the history of racism in the US were better able to recognize present day instances of racism. And of course, this makes perfect logical sense. If you're aware of the many different ways that racism has manifested itself throughout US history, you can much more easily see the continuity between these kinds of phenomena in the 1950s or maybe even 1900s, all the way up to the modern day. So it demonstrates first how this technique can be used for politically relevant research, but also it reinforces the point that knowledge is absolutely essential for everyone's political understanding. And looking into what people know and they don't know is a very worthwhile pursuit. So what we did in this research is we devised 20 true or false statements that relate to aspects of the dominant narratives you'll find in Russia and the US. And by dominant narratives, we mean the kind of stories or explanations about why the war started that were predominant in the US mass media and the Russian mass media. So we devised this survey, I think it was in March, late March, early April, we were finished with it. But we had a very hard time finding a survey company that would be able to administer the survey in Russia. Today in Russia, there are laws prohibiting the spread of propaganda. So any survey company that would share our survey or actually field our survey in Russia, could have been prosecuted because some of the statements, regardless of whether they were true or false, could have been labeled as anti-Russian propaganda. And so, at any rate, we finally found a company that was able to do it. And so we collected data in June, starting in June. So that's after people have had a few months at least to educate themselves, inform themselves, perhaps go beyond their favorite TV show and maybe read some articles, books, etc. To educate themselves further. So half of these items, half of the true and half of the false items, covered the dominant Russian narrative, and half of them covered the dominant US narrative. So what this allows us to do is to devise D prime measures, that is the measure of knowledge accuracy or the ability to distinguish true from false statements. And it gives us the ability to derive criterion scores, which is a measure of knowledge bias, a tendency to answer true or false to different sets of questions. Okay, so just to introduce what we perceive to be the dominant Russian narrative at the beginning of the war. And that is that the war is not actually a war, but just a special military operation. And the goal it is kind of like a humanitarian intervention. It's to protect ethnic Russians, to demilitarize a growing military threat, and to denazify the Russian government. Furthermore, another aspect of this narrative is that Ukrainians and Russians are brothers. The majority of the Ukrainian population recognizes this and does not want to have a bad relationship with Russia. But the problem is that the Ukrainian government is a puppet of the US controlled by neo-Nazis. And so the government is doing things that the broader population would not want them to do, because they view this brotherhood with Russia so dearly. So therefore, because of these initial facts or initial parts of the narrative, Russia's special military operation is not a war of aggression that's universally condemned by the world, but rather a very justified effort to protect ethnic minority Russians in Ukraine, get rid of neo-Nazis from the government, and ensure that the territory of Ukraine is not used by a hostile military alliance, NATO, led by the US, as a sort of staging ground that could be used in the future to threaten Russia militarily. So this is kind of like a very short summary of the kind of narrative that was found to be dominant in Russian mass media sources at the beginning of the war. And so I'll give you some examples of the actual items that we use. You'll see in parentheses, you see things like 1RT, 3RF, etc. That convention basically just means it numbers the statements, and then R refers to the Russian narrative, T and F refer to true and false respectively. So for an example here, one fact or statement that we asked people to answer, is this true or false, was that estimates of the civil war in Ukraine since 2014 find that over 10,000 people have died as a result. And that is a well established fact. There's a bunch of sources you can look to, but it also is related to that Russian narrative that there is a humanitarian crisis that needs addressing. Hence, it's part of the Russian narrative, the dominant Russian narrative, as we call it. Another one, though, a Russian false item. So this is an example of one of the ways in which we devised our false items. We would take something that's true and exaggerate it in a way that you can find also exaggerated in mass media in the two countries. So here you have the basic kernel of truth, that there have been a lot of people dying as a result of the civil war. But this goes even further and says that the government has intentionally been carrying out a policy of genocide, intending to eliminate an entire people on the basis of their ethnic or national identity. And that's what, by exaggerating that, we can kind of get some people who have heard propaganda lines about the genocide in Ukraine. This will help us distinguish between people who have an accurate set of knowledge about this issue versus people who have an inaccurate set of knowledge. Another example, 2RT. So this is another Russia narrative true item, that neo-Nazi and other far-right groups in Ukraine have been a concerning problem during the past decade. And there's lots of examples of this. Most of the reporting in Western media on this issue happened before the start of the war. And now this is a very sort of hot button topic because this is, of course, part of Russian government propaganda, that that Ukraine is just is full of neo-Nazis and it must be invaded so that we can get these neo-Nazis out of government. So there in the Russian propaganda narrative, you have this exaggeration of something that does have a very real kernel of truth. But I think we thought, and it turned out to be true, that a lot of people in the US wouldn't even recognize the kernel of truth, that they've only heard that this is a Russian propaganda claim. So there must not be any problem with far-right, ultra-nationalist, xenophobic movements in Ukraine. Then a Russia false item, this is another example of exaggerating something true and also following or providing an example that matches the dominant Russian narrative. And so this one just makes up a report that never existed, making a very expansive claim about the extent to which neo-Nazi groups are, wield power in the Ukrainian government. And just two more examples. Not all of the examples were paired. Some of them were independent facts that we thought were an important part of the overall narrative that we wanted to test. This one is a Russia false item that China showed its unconditional support for Russia by voting against the March UN General Assembly resolution deploring Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when of course the reality is that China abstained. Now that's a very small difference, but this little fact is connected to a broader understanding in some parts of Russia, whereby it's not just Russia kind of versus most of the rest of the world. Russia has a lot of support in the global South. And so a lot of Russians got this one wrong because they didn't realize that, China's support for Russia is very qualified. The fact that China and a lot of other countries in the world would abstain from the vote rather than vote no is an indication of the weakness of some of the international support that a lot of people in Russia have been led to believe exists. And then one last one, here's a Russia true item that under the Zelensky administration, the Ukrainian government passed a law restricting the use of the Russian language in a number of different fields. So that, you can see how that is related to the dominant Russian narrative of, ethnic Russians in Ukraine are being persecuted. But this is a very limited factual statement, very different from the kind of exaggerations that you would see in Russian mass media. Okay, what is the dominant US narrative that we observed at the time? That the war is actually, it's not just a special military operation, it's an illegal act of aggression under international law. If you remember the Nuremberg tribunals, the war crime of aggression was seen as the sort of mother of all war crimes, the ultimate war crime, because once you commit aggression, all other sorts of war crimes are almost guaranteed. I don't think we know of many examples of wars where no war crimes of any sort happened once the war started. So this is sort of the initial start of the US narrative. Then it's Russia's actions in this narrative are not motivated by what the government claims, these claims about NATO expansion or denazifying Ukraine, but rather what's really going on is that Russian nationalist revanchism, people who want to recreate the Russian Empire, that's a main motivation, not the stated NATO concerns, not the denazification concerns. It's restoring the Russian Empire and also a fear of democracy, because within this narrative, it's believed that Putin is afraid of democracy sort of breaking out in nearby countries, because then that might put pressure on him and his regime in Russia. And then, of course, that another part is that the Russian government's claims can't be taken seriously because NATO doesn't actually threaten Russia, and Putin himself even recognized this in the past. So that is part of a narrative poking holes in the Russian government narrative. Also, the charge of any sort of neo-Nazi influence in Ukraine is preposterous, not only because Ukraine has a Jewish president, but that in the last election, far-right political parties won under 3% of the vote. So rather, the true explanation in the US narrative, dominant US narrative, is that Russia is just a rogue, aggressive state. It ignores international laws and the norms of the international community. The US government is not at fault at all. It didn't do anything to aggravate or create fears within the Russian government. And the best explanation for the invasion is just the authoritarianism of the Russian government, Putin's desire to rebuild the Russian Empire, and his fear of democracy spreading close. So an example of some of these, again, I did the same thing. You'll see little parentheses here, and it just shows you which statement and whether it's true or false. And this is all on the US narrative side. So this is a true statement that in 2000, Putin expressed openness to Russian joining NATO, and that he had difficulty imagining NATO as an enemy of Russia. But here's a US false statement that when the Russian government, or the Soviet government at the very beginning, then the Russian government towards the middle of the 1990s, that in no way did Western leaders suggest that NATO would not expand further towards Russia's borders. Now, there's all sorts of contestation over the kinds of commitments made by different Western leaders. But as worded, this statement is really uncontroversial, that there's plenty of evidence of Western leaders suggesting, stating in conversation, in writings, et cetera, that NATO was not going to expand any further. Then another US true item, for example, is that the Russian Federation has been engaged in several wars since its recent founding. So that goes to the whole idea that Russia is this rogue state that is quite aggressive by nature. And then here's one last one. This is another US false statement that, according to a Freedom House report, Ukraine is ranked among the world's most democratic, human rights respecting countries, et cetera. So this here, we're trying to see if, there's a lot in the discourse in the US narrative about the war that sort of creates a Manichaean good versus evil story, whereby everything in the good country has to be good, everything in the bad country has to be bad. So we thought that this would be an item that would very well distinguish between people who were more knowledgeable about the state of the Ukrainian government versus people who are kind of affected by this halo effect of since this is the victim of aggression, then everything must be, basically good about the good guy, whereas everything about the bad guy is bad. So these are just a few examples of how we devised this 20-item signal detection survey. So before we go into the results, I think it's just important to mention a little bit of background about the Russian and US media systems. This is incredibly important because political knowledge is fundamentally a media effect. My favorite line about how this works is Scott Althaus. He wrote, "Facts don't have wings." Facts cannot just fly their way into our brains. Information, bits of information, are always physical. That is, they're always instantiated in some kind of physical medium. That could be, the sound waves coming out of my mouth right now. It could be the hard drives on your computers that store a lot of information. It could be the ink on pages and the books that you have. Information is always instantiated in some sort of physical medium. So in that sense, information is always physical. As such, it needs to be transported. Politically relevant knowledge, politically relevant information is generated in all sorts of parts of the world, primarily, arguably, in capital cities. And if you don't live in a capital city, or you don't live next to all of the places in the world where politically relevant information is generated, then you need to rely on a transmission system or a delivery system, logistical system for politically relevant information. And we call that logistical system for politically relevant information the media. So if we look at the Russian media system, you see during the 1990s a really scary disheartening sort of collapse, where the word for prostitute, as far as I can tell, first originated actually in Russia. You probably might have heard it said by or used by people on the right wing of Indian politics. But as far as I can tell, the first use of this term was actually came from the 1990s in Russia, because during this time where you had these brutal kind of gangster oligarchs fighting to steal control of public property to turn that into their own fortune, they would hire journalists to basically print propaganda to support their ownership claims, or to make them look like, great responsible statesmen, and their opponents were made to look like, untrustworthy oligarchs, etc. There were even price lists that media outlets would give out to show the cost for certain kinds of propaganda, but also counter propaganda. So if your opponent paid a media outlet to make your claim to be the owner of some industry, you could pay the media outlet even more to cover that up. That would be the counter propaganda. So in the 90s, the Russian media system in a very dire state. And then when Putin took power, the state basically took control of the Russian media system and used it to support the government. The US media system has none of the same sorts of forms of top-down government control as you see in Russia under Putin. But you do have, if you read the literature on the US media system, there's a massive range of biases that operate in the US media system, from commercial biases in various forms. For instance, you want to attract a wide range of viewers. If you're presenting perspectives that a lot of people in your target audience are going to find distasteful, and then they're going to tune out, that's a pressure. You've got to worry about putting off people in your potential audience by what you're including in your news coverage. There's also source bias, the fact that it's generally easier to find a US government spokesperson to make an official statement on any given issue, particularly on foreign affairs. And what a US government official says is just automatically newsworthy. There's someone with power disseminating the view of the US government. That in itself is newsworthy and viewed as deserving of coverage. But if you want to get a lot of dissenting views, you might have to find someone in academia or in an activist group. And then even just through the code of journalistic professionalism, going to a source like that would be viewed as much less newsworthy and potentially a form of journalistic bias. It looks like you're trying to find someone to disseminate your view. That's the sort of question that would come up if you see a lot of sources from academia or activists. People would say, well, why is that newsworthy? Who cares what these people say? It looks like what you're doing is trying to insert your own view here. Whereas if you just report what government sources disseminate, then that is viewed as unproblematic. I could go on for an hour, if not more, talking about all of these different forms of bias in the US media system. There's also indexing. That's when journalists basically they represent views on an issue in direct proportion to the distribution of those views within the US Congress. And of course, the problem there is if you have essentially unanimity in the US Congress on an issue, then you don't have a way of bringing in and presenting to your viewers or your readers what other views there are that perhaps nobody in Congress holds. So this is basically a huge topic in my book. But there's a whole range of these kinds of structural, economic, and political factors, but also psychological pressures. What audiences like, what they're turned off by, what makes them angry, what they find interesting, what they don't find interesting, etc. That produces what a former student of mine called, and once I heard this in a paper he wrote, I said, oh man, I've got to steal this idea. This is brilliant. produces in the end a form of censorship with American characteristics. There's no top-down government control in the way that there is in Russia, but there's a lot of bottom-up biases either coming from the demand side, that is the psychology of the audience, what they like, what they don't like, and from the supply side, that is the political economic pressures operating on media outlets that influence what they cover and what they don't. So because the political economy of media literature points out a number of flaws in the Russian media system and a wide range of very different flaws in the US media system, we expected that the Russian sample and the US sample would effectively look like mirror images of each other. That is that Russians would have more accurate knowledge when it came to the US narrative, the dominant US narrative, but they would have less accurate knowledge than people from the US when it came to distinguishing true and false in the Russian narrative. Likewise, we expected Russians to have a higher C criterion for Russian narrative items. That is, they would be more likely to answer true for those items that support the dominant Russian narrative as opposed to the US sample. And then in the US sample, we expected them to have more accurate knowledge, a higher D prime for Russian narrative items, but a lower D prime for US narrative items. And then the same thing with our measure of bias, the criterion score. We expected people in the US to be more likely to answer true for the US narrative items than our Russian participants, and more likely to answer false or less likely to answer true for Russian narrative items compared to people in Russia. Okay, so our results here. The first result I'll show you is our measure of response bias, or the criterion score. So you can see that for the Russian narrative on the top, the blue line, that is the Russian sample. You can see that they had a very strong pronounced bias towards answering true to all of our items that represented the Russian narrative. Now that is not just the true items, but also the false items. And then if you look at the bottom set of two bars measuring accuracy, or sorry, knowledge bias criterion scores for the US narrative, you see the opposite pattern, that United Statesians or US Americans were more likely to answer true than our Russian sample. Now, the most important measurement, of course, is D prime, our measure of knowledge accuracy. And here you can see the same basic pattern. So for the Russian narrative, it was US Americans who had significantly more accurate knowledge on items relating to the Russian narrative than Russians did. On the US narrative, however, you see the opposite pattern, that our Russian sample had much greater knowledge accuracy for items representing the dominant US narrative than US Americans had. Another aspect to see here is that it seems like US Americans did significantly worse overall because their accuracy towards the US narrative was significantly worse than Russians' accuracy was for the Russian narrative. I don't think this is terribly surprising when you consider that this war is one in which Russia is directly involved. It's something much closer to the lives of people in Russia than the US. In the US, I think the only people that are really deeply engaged in this issue are those who follow politics very closely. And that, of course, is a minority of the US population. So we weren't terribly surprised to find that this aspect of the result. But basically what we were expecting is just precisely this, that Russians proved to have more accurate knowledge when it came to the US narrative, and people in the US proved to have more accurate knowledge when it came to the Russian narrative. One last result to report, we had a bunch of other things in the survey. One of those things were 2 questions asking both samples for their opinions on the most hawkish or most militaristic opinions about the war. So for Russians, we asked them, to what extent do you agree with the statement, Russia should continue the war until victory, not stopping or considering stopping. The other one was Russia should use all means at its disposal to win the war. So those represented sort of the most hawkish or militaristic opinions one could have in Russia towards the start of the war. I suppose it would be much the same even today. We asked the people in the US, would you support a no-fly zone? We also, as a number of polls at the time did, we explained what a no-fly zone actually means, because a lot of people hear that, they think, oh, that's great. No military jets in the sky. That's lovely. No, we explained a no-fly zone would entail shooting down Russian jets, potentially destroying the weaponry that Russia is using to attempt to destroy the US or NATO's anti-aircraft weapons. Basically, we inform them what a no-fly zone actually entails. The second opinion that we asked them for their level of agreement was, should the US send its own troops directly to fight in the war? And what we found is that for our Russian participants, their preference for the most militaristic option in Ukraine was positively related to their knowledge of the US narrative. So the more accurate their understanding of the US narrative, that is, the better their ability to distinguish true from false, the more militaristic they were. However, it was the opposite relationship when it came to accurate knowledge of the Russian narrative. The more accurate their understanding, or the better their ability to determine true from false in items of the Russian narrative, the less likely they were to take a hawkish position on the war. In the US, it was slightly different. And I think this is another effect of the war simply not being as important for people in the US, not being as widely known or understood or discussed, et cetera. But what we did find was that preference for the most militaristic policies was related to knowledge inaccuracy. Or you could put it another way, their preference for less militaristic policies tended to go up as their knowledge accuracy went up. And that was primarily related to their knowledge of the Russian narrative, but it was in the same direction, although non-significantly, to knowledge of the US narrative. We have some other results that I'm not reporting here because we're first going to be working on a paper reporting on just the most basic aspect, and then a longer paper later revealing and discussing the results of a few other things we did in the survey. But my colleague Karim Batash added a very interesting experimental condition. So people in both countries were given 3 questions about their level of support for refugees, and then they were randomly shown either photos of white or non-white refugees accompanying the questions. So to prime them to think of refugees as either white or non-white people. And what we found is that the Russian respondents demonstrated a bias against non-white refugees. So when they got the pictures that portrayed refugees as non-white people, their support for accepting refugees was lower than the group that saw the photos of white refugees. In the US, the respondents did not demonstrate the same bias. I've got some thoughts about why that might be, but we can save that to the end if anyone is interested. We also had a measure of hawkishness or dovishness. That is yet to be analyzed, so I'll skip that here. Another thing that we'll analyze in greater depth in the longer paper is we found some relationships between knowledge and media use. So in Russia, you had a more accurate knowledge associated with the use of state-owned TV, but only for the US narrative. So what seems to be happening is in the Russian media system, they focus attention on the kind of weak points or the falsehoods in the dominant US government or US media narrative. And so people have learned what is true and what is false in the US narrative. There was a higher knowledge accuracy associated with the use of national newspapers in Russia, which is quite interesting. We're going to have to look into that a little more deeply. And then also there's a higher knowledge accuracy associated with the use of dissident media like Medusa, but only for the Russian narrative. So here, what seems to be happening is people who tune into dissident media learn better what is true and what is false in the Russian government's narrative. Whereas in the US, we found basically weaker results overall. People who view or tune into liberal media like MSNBC and CNN, they had a lower knowledge accuracy regarding the US narrative, but a higher knowledge accuracy regarding the Russian narrative. You had lower knowledge accuracy associated with the use of conservative media like Fox, and that was primarily due to a negative relationship with knowledge accuracy of the Russian narrative. And then lastly, we found a few sources that were associated with a greater knowledge accuracy overall, and that was National Public Radio and the financial press represented by the Wall Street Journal. Okay, so the broad conclusions here is that clearly it seems that the Russian media system is failing. If you look at this from the perspective of democratic theory, what is the media supposed to provide for people in a democracy? It's supposed to provide people with a broad range of perspectives and the information that they need to form their own opinions. Well, our results suggest that the Russian media system is not doing that at all. Rather, it's leaving people with a biased store of knowledge that tends to support the Russian government's actions here. But the US media system is not looking a lot better, at least based on this investigation. People in the US are not very well able to distinguish true from false in the items that make up the US narrative. They're less able to understand where there may be exaggeration or straight out falsehood in their US media sources. So from looking at the results in both countries, it's not terribly heartening. And why does this matter? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, the whole point here is that what knowledge you have and what knowledge you don't have probabilistically delimits the range of opinions you're likely to form. However, it's key to understand here that the knowledge you have does not determine your opinion. So you could have taken this survey and gotten a perfect score, gotten everything right, but nothing within the knowledge being tested guarantees that you're going to take one position or another. There's a lot of still, interpretation that can be done based on different sets of values, other information that you have that fits into your narrative understanding overall. But what we can say is that from our results, what people know and don't know in Russia is a set of information that would tend to support the Russian government's position. That is, people in Russia, given what they know and what they don't know, that knowledge base would probabilistically sort of push them in the direction of forming an opinion in favor of the war. And in the US, what people know and don't know would tend to push people into forming an opinion in favor of the US government's position in providing military aid, but also not pushing for peace negotiations. And in one reported instance, actively attempting to avoid peace negotiations. So here, let me just lay out some of the less likely opinions that people are less likely to form, primarily because of what they know versus what they don't know. So in Russia, it's less likely, given what people know and don't know, that people are going to form the opinion that this is a war of aggression. It's driven by great power politics, the desire to control more and to have more security and more power, rather than being driven really by sort of humanitarian concerns for ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So the sort of conclusion of this opinion would be the invasion should be ended, but that becomes less likely to be formed when people are missing key parts of the whole picture. And then in the US, the opinions that are less likely to be formed is that the Russian government is acting in a way that traditional great powers throughout history have acted brutally in order, traditional powers have acted brutally to maximize their power without regard for the suffering of others. That's less likely to be understood when you believe that there's this terrible genocide happening, and your government is going in to try to save people's lives and denazify a country, etc. This here is an opinion that's less likely to be formed when these claims about genocide and Nazis running the government, but you don't know the other facts that sort of go against that narrative. And so in the US, it's less likely, given what people know and don't know, that they would be pushing their own government to try to end the war through negotiations. So lastly, why does this matter? There's just two last points I'd like to make. So there's been a lot of talk about realism as an IR theory. A lot of people who did not really, weren't interested, in international relations. Once the war started, there have been a lot of disputes, debates, a lot of name calling, etc., around IR realism. So let me just explain really briefly, sort of elevator pitch for what realism is as an IR theory. It starts from the recognition that the world system is anarchic. That is, there is no global policeman that you can call when another country breaks international law. Therefore, all states in the system have to resort to self-help. They have to develop the power to do what the missing global policeman would have done had there been, a global policeman. Another part of the key another key part of the theory is that morality does not apply in this realm. That international politics is amoral. That you commit a category error if you try to apply morality, because it's a brutal world. It's a dog-eat-dog world. There's no policeman you can call. Every state needs to maximize its own power so it can defend itself against a potential act of aggression or war crime or what have you. So the realist school starts from this description of how the world is currently organized, and then it moves very deftly into prescription. It says, well, since this is how the international system works, therefore states should follow realist power maximization principles. That states should attempt to maximize their power at any expense and without any regard to morality, because that is the best way to prevent national extinction. That's the best way to prevent being invaded or otherwise destroyed or degraded. There's also a kind of left realism, which it's different because what it does is it says, yes, sadly, the realists are right that this is how the system actually works, but they're wrong insofar as they say that it should work this way. Rather, the sort of left realist view is that the system should be changed primarily through the efforts of the most powerful states in the system who have the power to actually make changes in the system. But a lot of the debate I've seen over the Iraq War, and particularly when IR realism gets brought in, is that people have a little trouble distinguishing between the descriptive and the prescriptive aspects of realism. And I think what we found in both countries is that people are lacking the kind of knowledge that we would expect them to have if they were well educated or well informed about how the international system works, and that I think fundamentally weakens their ability to understand this war, and more importantly, understand the war with the aim to end it as soon as possible. Okay, so I am going to stop there. I've gone quite long, so let me shut up now and just open up to any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. So let me stop the recording.